It began on a Thursday, though I didn't realize it at the time. Thursday mornings are usually dull for me, uneventful, except for the clatter of the train and the steady hum of commuters, half awake and fidgeting with their phones. But that morning, as I stepped onto the platform at the Maple Street station, something was different. Something small, almost imperceptible, but unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. I noticed him then, a man standing by the far edge of the platform, just beyond the yellow safety line. He was older than most of the passengers, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, with a thin frame and thinning hair. His clothes were ordinary enough, a dark coat buttoned up despite the warmth of the morning, but it was the way he stood that caught my attention, too still, as if he were rooted to the ground. And then, his eyes. His eyes were fixed on me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe he was looking past me, at something else, someone behind me. I turned to check, but the platform was crowded and no one seemed to notice him except me. When I turned back, his gaze hadn't wavered. He was still staring, and though his face was expressionless, there was something almost expectant in the way he looked at me. As if he were waiting for something. I felt a chill then, a strange prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I pulled my coat tighter around me, even though it wasn't cold, and tried to shrug it off. Just a man, I told myself. Just someone waiting for the train, like everyone else. But the feeling lingered, all through the day. Even after I boarded the train and lost sight of him, his image stayed with me. The thin, still figure, the unnerving way he had looked at me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once as I walked to the office, though I knew it was silly. By the time I reached my desk, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting. After all, it was just a look. People stare all the time. I was being paranoid. But still, when I left work that evening, I couldn't help scanning the crowd on the platform again. Just in case. He wasn't there. Not that night, at least. I didn't think about him again until the following week. My life returned to its usual rhythm: work, commute, dinner, bed. The man on the platform became a distant memory, something easily filed away as an odd encounter, one of those brief moments that slip out of your mind when the day demands your attention. But then, I saw him again. This time, it wasn't on the platform. I was at the grocery store, wandering down the aisles with my basket in hand, trying to remember if I needed milk. The store was half empty, just a few late shoppers like me, moving quietly through the fluorescent-lit aisles. I was reaching for a box of cereal when I felt it again, that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned my head slowly, hoping I wouldn't see him, hoping I was imagining things. But there he was. He stood at the end of the aisle, by the display of canned soups. His hands were in his pockets, and his eyes were on me. He didn't move, didn't pretend to be browsing the shelves. He just stared, as if he had been waiting for me to notice him. For a moment, my heart stopped. The air felt thick around me, pressing in, making it hard to breathe. I swallowed and looked away, forcing myself to focus on the cereal in front of me, trying to act as if nothing was wrong. But my hands shook as I reached for the box, and I fumbled with it, nearly dropping it to the floor. I didn't look back at him. I couldn't. Instead, I hurried down the aisle, turning the corner as quickly as I could. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could he be here, in the same store, on the same night as me? What were the chances? I told myself it was a coincidence, a strange one, but still just a coincidence. There was no reason to think otherwise, no reason to believe that this man, this stranger, was following me. But the thought lingered, growing stronger with each step I took. I didn't finish my shopping. I abandoned my basket near the frozen foods and made my way to the exit, my pulse quickening with every step. When I reached the door, I glanced back one last time. He was still there, standing at the end of the aisle, watching me leave. I walked home faster than usual that night, my footsteps loud against the pavement, echoing in the quiet streets. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. But every time I looked, the sidewalk behind me was empty. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the silence of my own home. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I didn't see him again that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting. Waiting for what, I didn't know. But I was afraid to find out. By the third time I saw him, I no longer believed in coincidence. It was a Wednesday afternoon, a week after the grocery store. The day was warm and sunny, the kind of day that usually lifted my mood. I had left work early, planning to meet a friend for coffee at a cafe downtown. The streets were busy, filled with the sound of cars, the chatter of people, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I was feeling lighter than I had in days, almost like myself again. But that changed when I saw him. He was across the street, standing near a newsstand. He wasn't reading the papers or flipping through a magazine, he was simply standing there, watching me. His eyes locked onto mine the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk. My stomach turned as a cold wave of fear washed over me. I froze, my mind racing through possibilities. Had I imagined it? No, it was unmistakable now. The same man, the same unsettling gaze. He didn't move, didn't smile, didn't do anything to acknowledge that he had been following me. But I knew. I knew it couldn't be anything else. I turned away quickly, ducking into the cafe where my friend was waiting. Inside, the warmth and noise of the cafe felt like a shield, something to block out the cold dread creeping through me. I found a seat by the window, but I didn't dare look outside. I didn't want to see him again. I didn't want to know if he was still there. My friend, Emily, was already sitting with her coffee, tapping away on her phone. She barely looked up when I slid into the seat across from her. "You look pale," she said after a few seconds, finally noticing my face. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just a long day." She accepted the answer easily enough, returning to her phone. I tried to join in, sipping my coffee and making small talk, but I couldn't focus. Every nerve in my body was still on edge, as if expecting the man to walk through the door at any moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer than I wanted to believe. When our conversation lagged, I finally decided to mention it. I laughed it off, as though I were telling a joke, but the words felt heavy in my mouth. "You ever feel like someone's following you?" I asked, stirring my coffee idly. Emily looked up, a puzzled expression on her face. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. "I don't know. It's just, I've been seeing this guy." "Not seeing him like that," I added quickly, catching her smirk, "but he keeps showing up. Different places. The train station, the grocery store, and today, outside. It's weird." She blinked at me, then laughed, as though I had just told her some silly story. "Maybe he has a crush on you. Or maybe he's just on the same schedule as you. People cross paths all the time, you know." Her words didn't comfort me. I wanted them to, but they didn't. There was something deeper than simple happenstance at play here. I could feel it, like a weight in my chest. Something that Emily couldn't see, or maybe didn't want to see. "Yeah, maybe," I murmured, pushing the coffee away. I wasn't thirsty anymore. After we said our goodbyes, I lingered in the cafe for a few extra minutes, pretending to check my phone. My hands trembled as I glanced toward the window. He wasn't there. Not across the street, not by the newsstand. He had vanished as easily as he had appeared, leaving only the residue of fear behind. But I knew, deep down, that he hadn't gone far. He was out there somewhere, waiting. Watching. And worse, I was starting to sense a pattern. He showed up when I least expected him, in places I should feel safe. The station, the store, the street. He was never close enough to touch, but always close enough to see. It was like he was testing me, watching my reactions, learning my routines. I started to wonder what would happen when he got closer. I couldn't sleep that night. The idea of him, this stranger, slipping into the edges of my life like a shadow, lurking just out of reach, filled me with a gnawing dread that wouldn't let go. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that people overlap, that I was probably seeing him because I was looking for him, that it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. But that logic dissolved in the darkness of my apartment, where every creak of the floorboards felt like a footstep and every shadow in the corner seemed to shift in the dim light. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, running over the same thoughts in circles, until I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I made a decision. I was going to confront him. I was going to demand answers, to find out why he was following me, if he was following me. I had to know. If I didn't, the fear would consume me. I left my apartment earlier than usual that morning, scanning the streets carefully as I made my way to the train station. It was still early, and the city felt quieter than usual. I kept my head down, moving quickly, nerves coiled tightly inside me. I wasn't sure what I would do if I saw him again, if I had the courage to actually confront him. But the thought of doing nothing was worse. When I reached the platform, the usual crowd was milling about, waiting for the next train. I walked to my usual spot, near the far edge, and waited. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe this time would be different. Maybe I wouldn't see him. Maybe I had been wrong. But then I felt it, that familiar prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the one that sent a chill down my spine. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. There he was. Standing just a few feet away from me, closer than he had ever been before. His face was as expressionless as ever, but his eyes, those dark, unblinking eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was my chance. I couldn't let the fear win. I took a step toward him, and then another, until I was standing directly in front of him. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the hammering of my heart. He didn't respond. He didn't move. He just kept staring at me, as if my question didn't make any sense to him. As if he couldn't understand why I was speaking to him at all. "I've seen you," I continued, more forcefully this time. "At the grocery store, on the street, outside the cafe. Why are you watching me? What do you want?" Still, he said nothing. His silence was maddening, like a wall between us that I couldn't break through. The longer he stood there, the more the fear began to seep back in, replacing the brief surge of courage I had felt. I reached out, almost without thinking, grabbing his arm. His coat was rough beneath my fingers, and I expected him to pull away, to react in some way, but he didn't. He just stood there, stiff and unyielding, like a statue. "Say something," I demanded, my voice trembling now. "Please, just tell me what you want." For the first time, he moved. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words, and then, finally, he spoke. "You've always known." The words were soft, barely audible over the noise of the station, but they sent a jolt of fear through me that was more powerful than anything I had felt before. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. I released his arm and stepped back, my mind racing. What did he mean? What had I always known? But before I could ask, before I could do anything, the train roared into the station, the doors sliding open with a hiss. The crowd surged forward, and for a moment, I was swept up in the rush of people boarding the train. When I turned back, the man was gone. He had vanished into the sea of commuters, as easily as if he had never been there at all. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and unease. After that confrontation on the platform, I didn't see him again. Not at the train station, not at the grocery store, not on the streets. He was simply gone, as though he had melted back into the city, leaving me to wrestle with the cryptic words he had left behind. "You've always known." I couldn't make sense of it. I replayed the encounter in my mind over and over, trying to decipher what he had meant. But the more I thought about it, the more elusive the meaning became, slipping through my fingers like sand. I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I had imagined the whole thing, if the man had even been real at all. But I knew better. He had been real. Too real. And yet, with each passing day, it became harder to remember the exact details of his face. His image blurred in my mind, as though the memory of him was fading, retreating into some dark corner of my consciousness that I couldn't access. I stopped mentioning him to Emily or anyone else. They wouldn't understand, and I didn't have the energy to explain. But the fear remained, gnawing at me from the inside, refusing to let go. Then, one night, everything changed. I was at home, sitting in my small living room, the television on in the background, though I wasn't really watching it. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic outside. I was restless, my thoughts still tangled up in that encounter with the man, trying to make sense of something that refused to be understood. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible knock at the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. No one ever visited me this late. I sat perfectly still, listening, waiting to see if it would come again. Another knock. Louder this time. Insistent. I stood up slowly, my body tense with fear, and walked to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. Something in the pit of my stomach told me not to open it. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, won out. I twisted the knob and pulled the door open. He was standing there. The man. But this time, something was different. His face was no longer expressionless. There was something there, something familiar, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. And when I looked into his eyes, really looked, I felt a strange jolt of recognition. "You know me," he said, his voice calm and steady, the same tone he had used on the platform. "You've always known me." The words echoed in my mind, and suddenly, everything shifted. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I felt as though I were falling into something dark and bottomless, something I had been avoiding for far too long. Memories surged forward, memories I had buried deep inside, memories I had refused to confront. Fragments of forgotten moments flashed before my eyes, a hospital room, a cold voice delivering news I didn't want to hear, a small box of belongings I couldn't bear to look at. And then, the truth hit me with the force of a tidal wave. The man wasn't a stranger at all. He was someone I had known, someone I had lost. Someone who had been taken from me too soon. I had pushed the memory of him so far down that it had become a stranger's face in the crowd. But now, standing before me, he was no longer a stranger. He was someone I loved, someone I had been running from. My brother. He had died years ago, a sudden and tragic accident that had shattered my world. I had never fully dealt with the grief, never allowed myself to process the loss. Instead, I had buried it, pretending it hadn't happened, pretending he hadn't existed. But the mind doesn't forget. It finds ways to remind you of the things you try to hide, of the truths you refuse to face. And now, here he was, standing in my doorway, his presence a manifestation of the pain I had tried so hard to suppress. "I couldn't leave you," he said softly. "You weren't ready." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The years of denial, the refusal to grieve, the empty spaces I had tried to fill with distractions and routine, it all came crashing down around me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." But he didn't respond. When I looked up, he was gone. The doorway was empty, and the apartment was silent once more. I sat there for a long time, the tears falling freely now, the grief finally breaking through the walls I had built around it. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel it, to really feel it. The loss, the pain, the emptiness. All of it. It would take time. It would take more than a night, more than a conversation with a ghost. But I knew now that I couldn't keep running. The man I had seen wasn't haunting me. He was waiting for me to acknowledge what I had refused to face. And so, I did. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, holding the memory of my brother close, finally allowing myself to grieve.